just to remind people, I was talking about what the relevant events are, some of the medium-term impacts, and then to consider some of the impacts on the nuclear non-proliferation regime and nuclear diplomacy more generally. I was talking on the more immediate impacts around NATO's willingness to defend Ukraine. Clearly, NATO is very concerned about the possibility of sliding into nuclear conflict with Russia, and that underlines NATO's prior unwillingness to offer positive security guarantees. So we have a situation today where Ukraine is conditioning its offer to become neutral on the offer of positive security guarantees that I believe both contradict the status of neutrality, but also that are not on offer in any case. Nevertheless, I think it's also important to point out that I think Russia's nuclear threats have garnered greater solidarity and outrage across other parts of the world, rightly or wrongly, which has actually underpinned the willingness to supply weapons to Ukraine and give unambiguous support. Basically, what we have here is a situation where emotionally Ukraine has managed to demonstrate a certain victim status that others have rallied around. So there's an ambiguous impact that has arisen out of the nuclear threats that have been made. And I think that's quite interesting for those of us who are looking at the utility and the effectiveness of nuclear deterrence, because it's not black and white. We've also seen today, these last few weeks, an extraordinary cohesion within NATO and the European Union that I think also has important medium-term impacts for nuclear non-proliferation. So let me come to those medium-term impacts. What I think we have is, on the one hand, we have quite a significant harm created to global governance and the ability of global powers to come together to tackle global catastrophic risks of all kinds, not only nuclear non-proliferation, but also climate change and other things that require greater cohesion. We have already seen an increase in defense spending in Europe, which I think is likely to lead to a greater securitization and a question about what the democratic values are within Europe. Because this defense spending is not going to lead to immediate impacts, this is the lead times on these defense spends have impact only in a year or two, or maybe even longer when it comes to new defense capabilities. So I think it's quite worrying for the long term that we have European and US defense spending going up. On the other hand, we have a massive cost of living crisis, bow wave coming our way over the coming months, obviously in Russia, but actually across the world, and government budget crises are very likely. So it's very difficult to see how these defense spendings can be sustained in the longer run, when I think citizens will be feeling the pain. There is a question about non-NATO European members. We have Sweden and Finland thinking about the possibility of moving closer to NATO. They've already abandoned neutrality status. They are now non-aligned, which means they do have defense arrangements amongst themselves, and they do have relationships with NATO. I think this is for me, it's a worrying move because, again, it underlines the securitization of the situation. I think in the medium term, it's very important that we recognize everybody's agency here in creating the crisis that we see playing out today. And when we consider European security, pan-European security, which includes Kazakhstan, we need to be thinking about inclusion here rather than division. And that means much more focus on organizations such as the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, the OSCE, and an approach that is more focused on common security rather than collective security. That is, security amongst potential adversaries, looking at ways in which they can reassure each other rather than arm against each other. It's interesting to me as well that we have had a bypass of the UN Security Council to the General Assembly and significant resolutions on the issue. I think that strengthens the possibility of calls for reform of the UN itself, and particularly the Security Council, and raises the prospect of alternative approaches to global governance. So how does all this play out in a year that not only sees a war in Ukraine, but also the review conference, which hopefully will happen at last in August in New York? Well, my first statement is that it is unambiguously negative. We have not only the divisions within the international community, but also we have lessons that are being learned, that deterrence is live, nuclear deterrence, and nuclear deterrence is perceived to be attractive. And that, I think, leads us to the need to sharpen arguments that, that the impact is ambiguous and that Russia did not necessarily benefit from making these explicit nuclear threats, or at the very least, the impacts were ambiguous. Bearing in mind that the United States is about to issue its nuclear posture review in the coming weeks, the signs prior to the Ukraine war was that President Biden was already stepping backwards, back to a more traditional stance of supporting nuclear modernization and resisting any significant move towards sole purpose or no first use. I can't see the Ukraine war positively impacting on the nuclear posture review, and I suspect that that will be seen as a litmus test of Biden's strategic resolve to confront Russia, which I think is deeply worrying. As I've said, we will have polarization within the international community, and that will play out within the review conference itself. Polarization between the nuclear weapon states and polarization between the nuclear weapon states and non-nuclear weapon states. But I think we need to focus, those of us who are looking for constructive moves towards disarmament, on what is effective rather than what is righteous. Kazakhstan is a member of the Stockholm Initiative alongside 15 other states that has been one of the few rays of light and hope in the non-proliferation regime. And I very much support Kazakhstan's position in that initiative. Unfortunately, the ambition of that initiative, I think, will need now to be modest in the run-up to August, and I suspect it will be focused on nuclear risk reduction. Nuclear risk reduction, I think, deserves a greater attention as a result of the Ukraine crisis, and I think it will do. And I think we need to be thinking about nuclear risk reduction beyond simply the installation of hotlines or risk reduction centers. We need to be looking at ways in which nuclear weapon states can reassure us that it is not simply two men's decision as to whether our planet survives or not in the coming months, but that this needs to be a shared authority. That nuclear weapon states need to be considering again the issue of sole purpose as a first step towards an international regime of no first use. This is a frustrating situation, but the review conference still has value. And those of us looking towards the review conference need to retain our long-term visions, and we need to sharpen our act in achieving movement. I'd like to finish with a reference to the Treaty for the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, which also meets for the first time this year in meetings of state parties. I have no doubt that there will be a great deal of outrage expressed at the first conference about the step back to a very dangerous and polarized situation. There will be questions raised about the relationship with the Non-Proliferation Treaty. There will be quite understandable blame leveled not just at Russia, but at all the nuclear weapon states. But we do need to be thinking about how the relationship with the NPT can lead to constructive moves towards nuclear disarmament, which means we need to be setting an agenda for the 2025 NPT review conference that is both realistic and ambitious. And I believe that means that we also need to be refocusing back on the humanitarian impacts that gave birth to the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons in the first place. And I think just to come full circle, I think that's where we as Pugwash and other international institutions need to be looking at the dangers of a significant exchange of nuclear weapons, particularly the prospects of nuclear winter. And I'll finish there.